Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. There is so much for us to do on the show here today. Obviously, we now know more about the situation involving Carson Beck, and now what seems like a certainty that Gunner Stockton will be the Georgia quarterback throughout the college football playoff here coming up. As Georgia tries to make that transition, we'll talk on the show today to a former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm, who is kind of a part of a transition of his own when he stepped in as the Georgia starter and also led the Dogs to the playoff. What that's likely to be like, Jake obviously knows Gunner well. We'll get some more insight from Jake about Gunner and obviously looking back on what might be the final moments in the career for Carson Beck. We'll talk about some of that with Jake Fromm. Great guest to have on a day like this. We'll do that coming up. Connor Riley also joins us today, too. There is potential rumor mill stuff as it relates to the transfer portal. You may have forgotten this, but this is also potentially a fairly big news day as it relates to Colbie Young one way or another. We'll get kind of a preview of what's expected to come out later in the day on Young. We'll do that with Connor Riley and just try to catch up and sort of look at everything that's going on here right now. But to begin things, obviously, Georgia kind of finds itself in a tough spot. When you have a quarterback that was as lauded before the season as Carson Beck was, to have that guy go down right before the college football playoff, that creates a situation where the path, the road can be challenging here for UGA. But as many Georgia fans suspect, there is a lot of belief within that locker room about the guy that stepped in and helped Georgia win against Texas, Gunner Stockton, and why Stockton might also be equal to the task that he's about to face coming up in the future games as Georgia tries to pursue another national championship. Where does this belief from Georgia players come from as it relates to Gunner Stockton? We're going to talk about that based on the words of one of Georgia's most important leaders going back to Saturday. I think it'll be a fun conversation. We'll do all of that. We'll address all the other stuff that's out there with Georgia right now, including, obviously, the news on Brett Thorson, too. So we'll cover it all. We're glad you're with us. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Well, we got something yesterday that I did not know that we would get. Something pretty official from Georgia. We'd said on yesterday's show that, kind of post-SEC championship, pre-bowl game, Georgia, like a lot of teams, has a tendency to sort of go radio silent. They kind of start getting to practice, and they don't have media obligations until they arrive at the bowl site. So, therefore, you really don't hear a lot from Georgia typically during this time of year. And so what we said was, after the injury to Carson Beck, I think the thought here is that Georgia would do everything that it could to keep this as secretive as possible and not reveal any of this information until it absolutely had to. That's just sort of the Georgia way when it comes to stuff like this. And a lot of teams would probably operate in sort of a similar manner. Well, Georgia actually took a little bit of a different tact yesterday. They did give an official statement on the record, kind of you call it like a press release type of thing. This officially came from Georgia. This is not a rumor. This is not a report. This is a release from Georgia itself. I want to read this to you, and then we'll kind of get into the situation as it relates to both Carson Beck and, by the way, punter Brett Thorson. Georgia writing that Georgia quarterback Carson Beck suffered an elbow injury during Saturday's Southeastern Conference Championship game. So that confirms kind of where the injury is after there had been some chatter about, is it this, is it that? That's a little bit of a confirmation on that, although Kirby had essentially said the same thing on Sunday. He says that Beck and his family are exploring treatment options, and there is no current timetable for his return. Also, Georgia releasing that punter Brett Thorson sustained a knee injury to his non-kicking leg in Saturday's contest, and he's going to require season-ending surgery. There's a quote provided here from Kirby Smart that says, Carson and Brett are both fierce competitors and extremely hard workers. I'm confident they will attack their rehab with the same determination they exhibit in their daily habits. We will be here to support them every step of the way. So while it doesn't say explicitly that Carson Beck will not play again this year for Georgia, and it does not say that Beck has played his last snap for UGA, I think there is some assumption. I mean, there's certainly a widespread assumption. Obviously, this means that Beck is not going to play this year for Georgia. That's essentially an announcement that Beck's season's done for UGA. And given the fact that before the season began, Beck was sort of talking as this would be his last season at UGA. Keep in mind, he's one of the final of the what you call like the COVID year guys that came in class of 2020. So he does have the option year to return next year. He was talking before the season began as this would be his last season at Georgia. So our basic assumption here is that not only is Beck done for the year, but Beck's career at Georgia very likely is done too. And so I think for Georgia fans, having kind of assumed this was going to be true coming off of Saturday, I think there's obviously sort of a natural energy that sort of builds around the idea of like next man up and, all right, you got to get ready for Gunner Stockton. Stockton's a little bit of a fan favorite because he's a tough guy, and a lot of guys, a lot of fans sort of feel like they knew him kind of growing up in high school, things like that. And I get all that, and I promise you we will get there in just a moment. I promise you. There is a real energy around the desire to rally around Gunner Stockton as he replaces Carson Beck. We feel it, and we want to be a part of it just as much as all of you do. But before we get there, can we take a moment here to appreciate, if it is the final moments for Beck in a Georgia uniform, can we take a moment to appreciate what he did for Georgia in these final moments? Y'all, Carson Beck was amazing, I thought, in the 8 overtime win for Georgia against Georgia Tech. Georgia had a big deficit that day, and who knows if everything for Georgia sets up as well as it does now in the postseason, if not for that win. Now, obviously, Georgia could have still beaten Texas and gotten one of the top 4 seeds in the playoff, things like that. But sometimes maybe feeding off that win actually also helped Georgia beat Texas too, that we thought, hey, that game against Tech perhaps provides a little bit of a rallying point for UGA. And in a game in which any mistake, given how big the deficit was to begin the game after drops and issues on defense, things like that, any mistake from Beck might have ruined the chance that Georgia could have won that game. And for the most part, Carson didn't really make one. Carson had a great game against Georgia Tech. It was an 8 overtime thriller. And for a guy that didn't grow up in Georgia and perhaps had to learn about clean old-fashioned hate once he got here to UGA, he'll certainly live on in the folklore of that rivalry for helping Georgia get the win that perhaps created the rallying point that now sets up Georgia for everything it has a chance to do now, including getting that win against Texas in the SEC championship. Carson Beck certainly is owed a debt of gratitude by us all for how he helped Georgia that day. I'll also say the same thing about Saturday, too. When we all saw Carson Beck coming back onto the field for what turned out to be the final play of the game and the touchdown by Trevor Etienne, and you're watching on the video right now, I mean, this is, I think the word we've used a few times, like cinematic. This is just one of the most cinematic scenes from a movie type thing I've ever seen. You can tell if you're watching a video. If you're listening to podcasts, I apologize. We don't typically try to do too much stuff that's video only, but perhaps you've seen this yourself, and maybe it's worth checking out the video so you can. Beck is walking onto the field. He's moving his left arm. His right arm is just hanging down. And I remember kind of wondering in that sort of press box as all this was happening, is he sandbagging? Like, is he really this hurt, or is he just sort of pretending his arm is that hurt, and he's about to spring a touchdown pass on Texas? But no, as it turns out, Beck really was so hurt that he could not move his right arm. I mean, his right arm right there is just hanging down, just essentially useless. Like he could not move it at all because of how injured his elbow apparently was. And yet, as you know, he still came out there, as Trevor Etienne says, gave him a perfect handoff, allowed Georgia to get that game-winning touchdown. And it certainly sounds like the guys in the huddle really fed off the fact that Beck did step back in. That's a lot of toughness. Listen, there ain't no way if my arm wasn't working, I could step back on the football field. I mean, honestly, if my back's a little sore, I want to take the whole day off. Beck steps back onto the field in a situation like that when his arm's not working, and you have got to make this a part of the way in which you remember Carson Beck. What an amazing thing. If this is the end, what a way to go out. And speaking of the guy that got that game-winning touchdown, Trevor Etienne, when Etienne spoke with reporters on Saturday after the game, to Etienne's credit, he was more than happy to describe just how awe-inspiring that final moment for Beck on that final play was, and the courage it took to get back on the field under the circumstances that Carson was dealing with. This is really good stuff from Trevor Etienne.
I mean, it just shows his toughness. It just shows what it means to him. You know, it's great to have someone like that on your team and be the quarterback. You know, he's a great leader. You know, it shows how much he loves the team.
So before we do anything else, I just think on behalf of everybody in Dog Nation, I just think it's appropriate to say thanks to Carson Beck. Thank you for helping get that win. Thank you for the way in which you led Georgia in that comeback to beat Georgia Tech. Thank you so much for the work that you have done to set up Georgia for what it has a chance to do now. That clearly, you played a huge role in all of that. And honestly, in a lot of ways, this season probably for Carson hasn't been what he wanted to be. There's been a lot of drops. I think Beck's own play at times probably hasn't been what he wanted, but he really became a warrior for Georgia over the course of these final couple of games. And I think he is certainly owed gratitude for that. And I know that Georgia fans feel the same way. Now, that said, there is a need to turn the page. And you thank Carson Beck for what he did, but you don't tap out on the season because, as we've been saying, this Georgia team does not quit. And there is a genuine, authentic belief, obviously among many Georgia fans, that Gunner Stockton can be a guy looking different than Carson Beck and, you know, certainly different probably than other quarterbacks that Georgia has had, but nonetheless a chance to be an effective player and a chance to give Georgia an opportunity to win all the games it's about to play, whether it's Indiana or Notre Dame to kick things off or perhaps after that, anything that may come its way, that Georgia has its chance here coming up with Gunner Stockton. It certainly sounds like Georgia players believe that too. And to go back to Trevor Etienne for a minute, one of the reasons it seems like Georgia players feel that way is because, to use the phrase that Kirby Smart has used before, the work while you wait attitude, that while you're not playing, can you do something to make yourself better so that when your opportunity does come, you're ready for it? It certainly sounds like, according to Trevor Etienne, he saw the sort of work while you wait mentality for Gunner Stockton, and he knew that Stockton would be ready if called upon because he'd been preparing for this moment without knowing for sure this moment would ever come. Once again, really good stuff from Trevor Etienne, this time on Gunner Stockton.
I mean, the way he prepares, man, I expect nothing less of him. You know, he comes in, work hard every day. You know, he's probably played this moment a thousand times at practice. Just tonight he was able to show the world what he can do. I'm just proud of him, man. Super proud.
So listen, I just think that, and you all understand this, I just think when it comes to the way in which players observe the actions of a quarterback, it's like little things that matter. You notice things. And when it comes to a quarterback, players either have confidence in that guy or they don't. And in the case of Gunner Stockton, Etienne, who I think probably speaks as forcefully as a leader for the offensive side of the ball as anybody Georgia has, despite the fact that he spent, a portion of the season injured, I think that Etienne is a very, very effective spokesman for Georgia overall. And he says, I've been observing the way in which he's working. And so therefore, when he steps onto the field, I know he's ready because I've seen the way that he's been working to get ready for this. And honestly, the proof was in the pudding on that because, look, after a first half on Saturday in which Georgia wasn't doing anything offensively, and Texas had the huge advantage in like yardage and time of possession, and you sort of really felt like, whether it was sort of a slow bleed out or whatever, that Texas was kind of on its way to winning this game unless Georgia did something dramatically to change the momentum. Well, in the third quarter, that's exactly what Georgia did. Found more success on the ground. It had the long scoring drive to begin the third quarter, and suddenly the imbalance that had been in Texas' favor with like the yardage and time of possession, things like that, that started to shift in the direction of Georgia. And, of course, that big drive to get all that started, that was led by Gunner Stockton. And once again, to hear Trevor Etienne tell it, the reason why that drive was able to be so effective with Stockton stepping into a role that he'd never been before is because there was this immediate agreement from the other 10 guys in the field that Stockton could get this done for him, so for all of them. So if you're a Georgia fan and you're looking for your reason to be confident in what Gunner can do, the fact that the Georgia players themselves were confident in Gunner this past Saturday, that ought to be a pretty strong piece of evidence to support that idea. Here's, once again, Trevor Etienne.
Just how confident he was. Just shows the preparation. It goes to show, when he's taking reps, mental reps, he's locked in, he's paying attention. And that speaks volumes about him. Because he's not QB1, he could be down, but instead he takes advantage of the opportunities that he get. and I'm just glad that he was able to come out and help us get the win tonight.
So that is Trevor Etienne explaining why Gunner Stockton has a chance to be a really effective leader for Georgia at the quarterback position. But let me kind of sum all this up this way. That while Stockton certainly has a chance to do everything that Georgia fans want him to do, and the fact that a guy like Trevor Etienne believes that he can do it seems to support the idea that Georgia could still be set up for success even after the Carson Beck injury. I think it's really important that we cast this narrative in the right way. In other words, we're all sort of used to in college football, there's a lot of examples, including one of the guys who's going to join us later on, that Jake Fromm once stepped into Georgia as the backup quarterback, and sort of magical things seemed to happen once he stepped in, and Georgia goes on this really fun run in that 2017 season. We're going to talk to Jake Fromm about all of that coming up in a little bit. That college football fans have just sort of gotten used to the idea of backup quarterback magic, and he steps in and everybody rallies around him. And for Georgia in this situation, of course that could happen. Georgia's got good players at all positions and good backups at these positions too. This is a program that sort of builds itself on great quality depth. Quarterback position would, of course, be no different. And Gunner Stockton truly is, as people have, including myself, have observed, going back to his time at high school in Rabun County, the sort of player that just sort of seems to have a little something special about him. And I think a lot of folks are genuinely excited to see what he's going to be able to do. But while we kind of express all of this and share this excitement about Gunner's chance taking place during the college football playoff, I think it's really important that we not make it sound any easier than it actually is. I think that's really important because this is still a very challenging thing. And losing the starting quarterback that began the year as like a Heisman favorite and a prohibitive favorite to be a number one draft pick and things like that, losing that guy right before the college football playoff is potentially just as difficult as it sounds like it would be. Just conventional wisdom would assume that's a difficult challenge for a team. And for Georgia, we shouldn't assume that's any different for UGA than it would be for anybody else. In fact, I saw there's a guy named Brad Powers. He's a gambling expert. He was on X last night talking about how in a kind of a look-ahead matchup with the potential of Georgia facing Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl, right now odds makers, I guess, have Notre Dame as the favorite over Georgia. I believe it's 2.5 points, which is ironically the same point spread that Georgia had against Texas this past Saturday. So certainly no guarantee that Notre Dame would win that game. But there will be growing belief that if Georgia's playing with Stockton, they may not be able to beat anybody, including the potential of Notre Dame coming up in the Sugar Bowl. And while we love the idea of proving all those folks wrong and making the doubters regret whatever they're saying, while that's sometimes a fun storyline for Georgia, we should at least consider that even in sort of the magical game on Saturday where Stockton helped Georgia win, the moments in that game weren't all perfect either. So let's have the proper appreciation for this moment. I do think that Gunner Stockton has a real chance to write a very fun chapter in Georgia's football history by how he plays in this college football playoff. But let's none of us act like it's any easier than it actually is. Georgia's going to be facing an uphill climb. Georgia's got a couple of weeks to rally around this new quarterback, this new signal caller, and put together a game plan that gives them a chance to succeed. But if they could do it on Saturday against Texas in a hotly contested SEC championship, perhaps there's no reason to think they couldn't do that now moving forward. And certainly watching how this team tries to figure all this out should certainly be a ton of fun to observe. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're glad you're with us, no matter how you get to us, video, radio, podcast. Just so thankful to have you here and really appreciate our friends at ServPro who make it all possible. When it comes to big-time cleanup situations, fire damage, water intrusion, when you have a mess in the home you live in or the commercial property that you own, perhaps you have rental property, when something happens there, whether it be a roof collapses and like all of a sudden you know how the water comes in on something like that, or a fire breaks out, or maybe a water pipe bust, anything like that kind of leads one of those things of, gosh, I wish I could wave a magic wand right now and put all this together like it never even happened. Well, that's what ServPro really does. The folks that are going to come out for you, they're called restoration specialists. That means they specialize in restoring your property to its original condition. You'll never even know that anything happened. I've seen this firsthand when it comes to our DawgNation World Headquarters studio, and you can see this for yourself too. So please find them online. It's servpro.com, SERV, servpro.com. You can find out more about that. Every ServPro franchise, independently owned and operated. Find them online, servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com. All right, as I kind of alluded to a moment ago, we have two really big guests coming up on our show today. It is Jake Fromm later on. This is an awesome day to have Jake on the show because he's got so much insight into Gunner Stockton, the career of Carson Beck, if this is the end for that, and kind of how this transition is likely to go because Jake, when he was the Georgia quarterback, was also kind of involved in one of these sort of, you got to be ready and you got to do your thing. And Jake, to his credit, was more than equal to that task back in 2017. And he'll give us some real insight into all of this coming up in just a little bit. Also, Connor on everything else happening around Georgia today. There's potential news involving Colbie Young. We will get to that. There's transfer portal rumors that we got to talk about here, too, what Georgia's kind of, I guess, agenda is going to be in the transfer portal. In fact, before we bring on Connor and do that, let's get ready to go around the doghouse here right now and talk about that very topic here for a moment. Kirby on Sunday was speaking about being in the college football playoff and having beaten Texas and obviously giving us a lot of updates on the likely injury to Carson Beck and how Georgia would potentially go to work with Gunner Stockton at quarterback. But in the midst of that, there was also a moment to acknowledge the fact that yesterday the transfer portal did officially open too. And so Kirby was sort of asked about what Georgia would be looking for in the portal. And obviously Kirby certainly keeping all of his options open here. This is what Kirby Smart said about the opening now of the transfer portal and how active Georgia will look to be. Here is Kirby Smart.
There's not a position that we don't have enough depth at. I mean, I repeatedly say we have less depth than we've ever had before. So we evaluate the transfer portal on who fits our culture more than we do who fits our talent level. There's tons of talented guys out there. We just want to find people that want to fit our culture and really our ethic, because it's not a place to go to if you're just looking for sheer numbers. I mean, you got to want to win and you got to want to make sacrifices for the team here.
And when Kirby says that, I can't help but think about the guy we just heard from a little earlier, Trevor Etienne. I mean, Etienne was a transfer player to this program, came obviously from our hated rival Florida. But when you talk about someone who came in and made a positive contribution to Georgia's culture, well, of course, Etienne seems to be that guy. I mean, I think he's been sort of credited as being one of Georgia's key leaders all season long, despite the fact that he hasn't really been available to play the entire time. But in terms of understanding what it takes to get where you want to go, even though that Etienne for himself in his career hasn't been there, boy, it seems like every message he sent to this team has been really strongly received. So this is a guy who came in and became a positive contributor to Georgia's culture almost right away. So when Kirby says that's the kind of transfers that we're looking for, I think that you would take that seriously, because it seems like, and certainly in the case of Etienne, that is exactly what has been true. But also beyond that, I think there's the assumption here that, if we're just being honest, Georgia has been somewhat limited by its wide receiver play here this year. There have been some drops. There have been some real issues there. And when it comes to unlocking the full potential of what the Georgia offense could be, perhaps being a little bit more aggressive to bring in the best available players, maybe that's just something that Georgia needs to do. And obviously there's going to be some losses in there too. Obviously yesterday there was some news and report about a Nitro Tuggle and, of course, all of that. So you're going to see some attrition even from the Georgia roster here, but also the chance for Georgia to make itself better through the portal. And it's already kind of done that with the 2025 class with guys like Talon Taylor and all the big names that Georgia, C.J. Wiley signed in the class of 2025, but also kind of going out there and trying to get those transfer portal names too, and perhaps spending the kind of dollars that makes that a real outcome. Because if you want the best receivers, you got to spend big dollars to get them. And if you kind of spin on the budget aisle when it comes to that, then you might not be happy with the overall results you get as a program. And that's just sort of the base level bottom line when it comes to that. So with that in mind, you're already seeing some of these rumors pop up. I'll show you this on the screen from our friends over at On3, who reported that Georgia Tech wide receiver Eric Singleton, who is in the transfer portal, a very good player, by the way. Max Olson saying he's going to visit Ole Miss and Georgia and Auburn this week. On3 has him as the #1 player in the transfer portal, at least on where this is right now. So Singleton's one of Tech's best players, a guy who's really electric with the football. And as he goes in the transfer portal, you get the idea there that this is somebody, according to On3 and other kind of rumor stuff that's out there, that Georgia might be trying to pursue. But at the same time, programs like Ole Miss that have a real history of spending big on transfers, they're kind of going after this as well. So is this an example of Georgia kind of raising its level financially to say, we're going to go after not just receivers, but the very best receivers in the portal as a way of upgrading ourselves to that position? I do think that's kind of an interesting thing to watch for, and kind of a compelling rumor to see Georgia connected to a name like that as the transfer portal officially opens. We'll get more from Connor Riley on that here in just a moment. But for now, let's call that Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. And by the way, before I bring Connor on the show, let me give you a quick reminder here, too. We announced this at the very end of yesterday's show. Want you to know this here today, that obviously we had a great DawgNation invasion in Atlanta on Saturday for the SEC Championship. A lot of folks wondering, okay, what's next for DawgNation as far as DawgNation invasions and our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips? I want you to know that we've got big plans to do a big DawgNation invasion to New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl. It'll include all the stuff that you've kind of come to expect. We had hundreds of folks travel with us to Austin for the game in October. This is going to be very similar to that. You'll have the Friday night or whatever night, the night before the game party. You'll have the day of the game tailgate. You'll have travel, accommodations that'll include a great hotel. We'll have all kinds of fun in and around New Orleans and Bourbon Street. Tickets to the game, if you want to be a part of that too, you'll have a chance to perhaps do that as well. So just know there's big announcements coming from our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips about a huge DawgNation invasion. In fact, I was in a meeting yesterday on the T-shirt design for this, so we're going to have a great time with the DawgNation invasion going to New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl, so be ready on all of that. But for now, you also going to be ready for the transfer portal and all the big news that could be dropping. So let's try to cover all of that and more as we get ready to welcome in Connor Riley today to DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Busy time for Georgia as it relates to news. Transfer portal a part of that. So Connor will jump right into it. Saw the rumor yesterday about Singleton from Tech going to the portal, an exciting player, among the very best transfer players perhaps available in this year's portal, and kind of an immediate rumor potentially connecting him to Georgia, but obviously there's a lot of other suitors for him as well. So if you want to give me a specific opinion about Georgia and Singleton, you can. But I think beyond that, what I'm also interested in is when you see Georgia immediately connected to a name like this, is this an example that Georgia wants to kind of spin big to be involved in the very best transfer wide receivers that are going to become available?
Yeah, one, I guess in the time since you've gone on air, there's become a bigger name that's gone into the transfer portal. That's Missouri five-star freshman Williams Nwaneri.
Wow.
That Georgia heavily recruited out of high school a year ago. We'll see if they're willing to spend big to get involved there. As far as answering your question when it comes to Singleton, when you see Ole Miss up there, when you see Auburn up there, those teams are going to want to spend. They're going to want to spend money. They've spent money specifically at the wide receiver position, both in the recruiting trail and in the transfer portal before. And I'll be honest, it's cool that they're being connected to him. They have to go out there and land him for me to really believe that they are spending bigger, spending more when it comes to the wide receiver position in the transfer portal. Because it's nice to sort of sit around and talk about that, Georgia's opening up the checkbook and their, I guess, the credit card, because nobody really uses checkbooks anymore. And for your Gen Z audience out there, checks are a thing that you sort of write and they're good for legal tender. It's an old person kind of thing out there. So I think with wide receiver in particular, and look, we're coming just days after Justice Terry goes to Texas and Georgia sort of gets big boyed at the last minute there by Texas. Sure, if you want to see that Georgia is mentioned with guys like this, that's great. They have to actually go out there and land a player of Singleton's capabilities and ability before I actually really start believing that they are committed to spending more and doing. Because it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to actually go out there and get the prize that Singleton is.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this has obviously been one of those things you've kind of maybe assumed in the past that Georgia might be a little hesitant on. And if I'm just being honest, I think the overall wide receiver play this year reflects the actions of a team that's been a little hesitant to spend big bucks on that position. Does that seem fair to you?
Absolutely. And look, part of this is, Georgia has not recruited well at the wide receiver position out of the high school ranks in recent years. The two signing classes that Brian McClendon brought in have just two receivers left, Anthony Evans and Colbie White. And so they've had to turn to the transfer portal to try and patch it together. And you've seen the dangers in leaning on the transfer portal in that regard at that wide receiver position. Ra Thomas dismissed from the team. Michael Jackson already bounced and looking to go elsewhere. Colbie Young suspended from the team this season as well. And so the reality is, if you're taking a guy out of the transfer portal, there's maybe at best a 50-50 chance that he turns into a contributor for you. Yes, Georgia did land Lennon Humphreys. They landed Dominic Lovett out there, but that's still of a hit rate. That's out of the 5 guys they brought in the last 2 cycles, 2 of them have been positive contributors. We'll see what ultimately happens with Colbie Young. But I think that's such a big reason why this wide receiver signing class that Georgia is bringing in, Talon Taylor, C.J. Riley, Tyler Williams, Thomas Blackshear, and Landon Rolden, those guys are the future. And Georgia knows that moving forward, they need to spend more at the high school level on wide receiver. And I think you've seen that in how they were able to land Taylor and Wiley. I think that because of the past mistakes in recruiting and because of the past misses in high school recruiting, they're once again going to have to play this transfer portal game. And while we all like Eric Singleton as a receiver and what he might be able to bring, as we've seen with so many receivers that have cycled through via the transfer portal in recent years, it's no guarantee that they end up being the guys that Georgia thinks they're getting.
So you mentioned Colbie Young. I'm going to talk to you about him in a moment. One more thing on this before we get there, though. You also see the door swinging both ways in this. There was the Nitro Tuggle news from yesterday. A relatively quiet start to the transfer portal for Georgia in terms of player departures. Maybe their status as a college football playoff team is impacting that right now. I guess, like, how much more are you bracing for on that in the next kind of couple of days? I mean, we've already got the Michael Jackson thing. We had the, Julian Humphrey thing, going back before the SEC championship. Like, how much are you bracing for in terms of these Georgia names exiting from the program?
Not a ton at this point in time. I think, especially with a lot of the younger players, first year, second year guys, they don't know what it's like to win a national championship. That didn't happen for Georgia last year. And so I think that these guys want to go through this ride and sort of see where it goes. There are obviously guys that are going to be transferring out of this program. Georgia had 21 players transfer out a season ago. I'm not saying it's going to get that high, but there are some obvious candidates in my mind for people that would be looking to go elsewhere and continue their development. So Nitro Tuggle, the first one to do it. Michael Jackson, Julian Humphrey have done so as well. There might be, a small handful of more players that like to do this that are sort of weighing their options. But I think, like a lot of the top teams, they're going to wait until the final season ends, or at least Georgia's season ends, before hopping in the portal, because it's important to know, well, the transfer portal does technically close on December 28th. You just have to be in the portal for teams to contact you and ultimately find yourself a new home. And teams playing in the college football playoff get an additional 5 days to enter the portal after their season has come to an end.
Shifting gears to Colbie Young here for a moment, I think it's interesting that obviously when the Young stuff first started, kind of like when the narrative on that started to shift, I think it was a really hot topic for a lot of Georgia fans. But because of signing day, because of SEC championship, because of transfer portal, it almost kind of gets buried that today is a very important day for Young's future, just in general for himself personally, but also potentially for Georgia too. This is the arraignment date for Young. I think a lot of people have sort of assumed that perhaps this will be a day when those charges get dropped, and if so, certainly based on the statement from Young's attorney, and also some of the read between the lines stuff on Georgia, that the path may be open for Young to return to Georgia's active roster. What are you expecting to happen today for Colbie Young, and then what do you expect to happen after that?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting because we've seen the Title IX investigation find Young, clear Young of any wrongdoing here. And yet these charges still have not been dropped despite, public attempts to pressure, I think, the district attorney's office or the solicitor general's office to have these charges dropped. And so the arraignment is around 1:30 Eastern time today. We'll find out then and there if these charges ultimately get dropped. If they do, that clears the way for Colbie Young to come back onto this football team. But if they don't, and these charges are brought against him, and ultimately, he potentially has to go to trial in that regard, it makes the situation all the more murkier. And so the fact that we haven't had these charges dropped or the case dismissed already, I think does maybe give you some hesitation that they're going to do it today. But this could also be a day that it happens as well. And in doing so, if Georgia's able to get Colbie Young back, you get a wide receiver on the outside that you don't have to scheme open. And quite frankly, they don't have a guy like that on the roster right now. Just a big-bodied guy that whoever the quarterback is can just throw it up to and they can go get it.
So obviously in like baseball, you have a postseason roster, and so you have to announce that. And in football, you don't do anything like that. In other words, if Young gets the charges dropped and he's going to play again, Georgia doesn't really have to announce anything, right? Because he was never really – I mean, I guess he's been indefinitely suspended. Would they have to announce that he's back, or could he just go to New Orleans and play in the game without Georgia ever saying anything officially about that?
I imagine Georgia at some point is going to say something officially in regards to Young. Whether or not that comes and how quickly that comes after his case is potentially dropped, I don't know. But there are going to be media opportunities between now and when Georgia plays in the Sugar Bowl on January 1st. Colbie Young is going to get asked about in the event that these charges ultimately get dropped. So I would expect at some point some sort of indication that Colbie Young is back and with this team.
Georgia did make an announcement yesterday as it relates to Carson Beck and Brett Thorson. Let me do the Beck part of this first. I think for some people it can be confusing when the official language of a statement like that, where there's no timetable for return. I think that some people sometimes don't quite know how to interpret that, but that's essentially as close as Georgia's going to come to saying Beck is not playing for Georgia for the remainder of the year. I also sort of interpret that, Connor, as do you disagree with that?
I don't feel comfortable saying that Beck is done in the manner in which I think you just did there.
Well, then tell me more about that then.
Again, and there's a story up on DawgNation now talking to an orthopedic surgeon about what a UCL injury looks like. And I find it interesting that another reporter had reported that it is a bruised UCL injury ligament there. It is an injury that if it is a grade 1 sprain, then there is the potential that I think if he's able to potentially come back by that second playoff game, the semifinals there, I think that maybe has the door open there. But if it is a more significant tear, a grade 2 partial tear of the injury, obviously then he would be lost for the season. So I think the fact that they are looking at more options, this is an injury. It's important to note that if you get hit, like especially in some of the manners that Carson Beck has taken hits so far this season, can be done. And so we'll ultimately see and find out with what Carson Beck is doing here. Sure, is there some gamesmanship on the Georgia side to keep this open? Absolutely. If I'm being honest here, do I expect him to play in the Sugar Bowl? I don't right now, but I would not go so far to completely rule Carson Beck's career at Georgia done.
What do you make about the fact that this is seemingly, based on that statement, being done by Beck's camp sort of outside like the Georgia medical team here? What do you make of that?
I think that they're trying to weigh all options because it's important to point out, like, Carson Beck does have an NFL future. I know he's, may not be a top 10 pick as he hopefully envisioned, certainly not the number 1 overall pick, especially in regards to this injury, but that is something that he has to look out for as well. And so I can understand in this instance of a player going outside the traditional route of totally trusting the Georgia team doctors and the Georgia infrastructure there when it comes to that. And you can understand why Georgia would want it a certain way as well. It is a personal health decision here when it comes for Carson Beck. And while Carson is obviously wants to be out there on the field, he came back into the game when he did not have to on Saturday in the SEC championship game. I think that this is a situation that merits weighing all the factors and learning as much as you possibly can about this injury.
No, I think that's really interesting. How much, if there's concern that it's a severe injury, how much does this potentially impact the way that he's viewed by NFL draft scouts? Would this be the kind of thing that would be a red flag for them? Is the recovery on this straightforward enough that they don't really care? How much would this impact how NFL draft scouts would view Carson? And I guess at the very least, if it's the more severe version of this, then I guess his ability to even work out prior to the draft would certainly be impacted by that.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting. There is a recent history with this injury. Brock Purdy tore his UCL in the 2023 NFC Championship game against the Philadelphia Eagles. He had some serious swelling, and so his surgery was delayed a couple of weeks, and he was still able to return and start the first game of the season for the San Francisco 49ers. So it is an injury that is very different than traditionally you see with baseball pitchers because of the different throwing mechanics that come with throwing a football compared to throwing a baseball. The type of surgery required for this is usually known as Tommy John. And so, again, I think that's why they're waiting to see, all possible options that are on the table here. Can this injury heal naturally? Do they need to go in there and clean it up? Or does it need a complete reconstruction there? And that's obviously all going to factor into how NFL scouts see him. I don't think that this is, a an injury that takes him off teams' draft boards. He's got plenty of college tape, 2 years of starting experience, over 850 career pass attempts. So I think that there is plenty of tape out there. And while, yes, you would have liked to have seen him, potentially play well and lead Georgia down the stretch, he is who he sort of is as a prospect at this point in time. So maybe he could have helped himself a little bit, but I don't think that there was a world, even if he was fully healthy and even if he were to lead Georgia to a national title, given how poorly he played in that stretch of games earlier this season, I don't know that there would have been enough there to overturn that poor play, even with this injury now bringing questions into the regard.
Very quickly, to finish things off when it comes to Brett Thorson, I think this is one of those that's kind of quietly a pretty big deal for Georgia, too. I mean, obviously, yeah, as I think you pointed out, sitting next to me in the game on Saturday, with Beck going out, Thorson was also Georgia's holder, and then he goes out from there. So that kind of impacts your field goal operation. But also the ability to flip the field with a great punt is just a real weapon, and Thorson is just an awesome punter. He's such a terrific punter. Now, I guess Drew Miller steps in, although it was Charlie Ham that was on the field for the fake, right? But it'll be Drew Miller who is the punter now for Georgia going forward, and maybe he goes on to have, maybe he's the next Ray Guy, I don't know. But losing Thorson is a pretty big deal for Georgia because in a lot of these games he's going to be playing, field position is going to really matter.
Yeah, this is a compounding injury where you lose your quarterback and then you think, okay, we're going to have to change the way we play, maybe lean on a run game, defense, play field position. And then you lose a Ray Guy finalist, one of the best punters in the country in Brett Thorson. It is absolutely going to have an impact on this team. Gunner Stockton was the holder after Beck and Thorson both suffered their injuries there that day. And so moving forward with Miller, it'll be interesting to see. He's never punted in a game for Georgia. In the next game he punts in will be the Sugar Bowl and a college football playoff game. So there's certainly going to be some pressure there on him in that regard. As far as Thorson, you're absolutely right, BA. He's a guy that can flip the field. For so long had not given up a big punt return or a punt return in any regard. And then they do give up two in sort of quick succession here, one against Tennessee, one against Texas. And so moving forward, I wonder how this changes how Georgia operates on fourth down. And they've been more aggressive generally this year on fourth down than I think they have been in years past. I think in part that's because of the struggles of the offense. But now, in those in-between situations, in those fourth and short situations, like we even saw on Saturday in the opening drive of the game, if it's 4th and 1 and you don't have the same confidence to flip the field with your punter like you did with Brett Thorson, does that maybe make you more aggressive and more considering of going for it on those 4th and 1, 4th and short situations? It's going to be fascinating to see from a just mindset standpoint how not having an All-American punter and Brett Thorson out there changes the way that Kirby Smart manages the game.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Connor, a lot going on right now. We appreciate your coverage of it all. We'll look forward to having you back here. And at some point in time, we got to go back and talk about the game itself against Texas and the stuff that happened to Justice Terry. Eventually, we'll get to all the stuff that's happening. But for now, we're just trying to do our best to keep up with what's actually going on in the current moment. So we're doing the best we can. We appreciate that, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So interesting there that Connor strikes a somewhat hopeful tone when it comes to Carson Beck. So at least consider that as a possibility. And look, you want as many healthy players as you can. You want, Beck and his ability to throw it. You're happy to have a guy like Gunner Stockton if Beck can't play, but you want all options on the table. So if something happens for Beck and he can return, then obviously I believe that would be welcome news for UGA. We'll talk more to Jake Fromm about this here coming up in a moment. In fact, we'll get to him kind of quickly. Let me go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And boy, I tell you what, there are so many fun things going on with Royal Caribbean here right now. And when it's cold outside, it kind of gets me thinking about the Caribbean a little bit more. So let me remind you that when I'm kind of thinking about my Royal Caribbean cruise vacations, I'm sort of starting with, okay, what port do I want to sail out of? And for me, that's Port Canaveral. And the reason why is I like to drive. In fact, when it comes to New Orleans and Sugar Bowl, I'll almost certainly drive there. When I can drive, I want to. Just one of my little quirks, I guess. And so I like going to Port Canaveral because it's a very drivable port from where I live here, in North Georgia. So, driving to Port Canaveral, obviously right now, the great Utopia of the Seas, that's sailing out of Port Canaveral. Coming up later on this summer, Star of the Seas, which will be the newest in the Icon class of ships. That's going to be sailing out of Port Canaveral. So I love the investment that Royal Caribbean's making in Port Canaveral right now. great new ships, awesome experiences, which is the closest port for many of us. So Jessica Slater is a wonderful travel agent. She can tell you all about this. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and she'll tell you everything you need to know about all the really cool stuff that Royal Caribbean has planned for 2025 and why so much of that is happening much closer to you than perhaps you realize, including our DawgNation cruise, by the way, coming up in April. So this is going to be a little bit of a shorter version of Cruise Around the SEC because I do want to get to Jake Fromm because there's a lot to talk to Jake about what's going on with Beck and Gunner and all of that. We'll get to all of this here coming up in a little bit. Let me just remind you, though, that the transfer portal now is officially open. We're obviously watching for this from a Georgia standpoint, but we are also monitoring a lot of these other rumors as they pop up. For instance, yesterday there was a really big one as related to Dylan Raiola. Obviously, Georgia fans know Raiola pretty well. There had been some chatter that Raiola might be looking to leave Nebraska. I guess Miami had been mentioned or whatever. But Raiola did kind of give you the Go Big Red or whatever tweet yesterday. I don't believe it was AI-aided poetry this time. But Raiola did kind of give you the confirmation that he is staying at Nebraska. So we're going to see a lot of this where it's like big rumor and some of that kind of dematerializes. I think there are a couple of SEC teams to watch pretty closely here. I think they'll maybe watching, what happens for, Alabama. Obviously, there's some thought some guys may leave. I think there's some curiosity around what the future of Bama at the quarterback position might be. That's worth watching. I would also mention LSU here a little bit, too, in that this is a team that's really swung and missed when it comes to big spending. Lost Bryce Underwood for the class of 2025. They obviously really made a point to go after defensive linemen in the spring portal from a year ago, and that did not work. And this was not really a championship contending team, I would say, in part because of that. To me, that's a really intriguing team to watch as this transfer portal opens. And, of course, as Connor mentioned right there, as I guess we're coming on the air or whenever, I'd missed this before the show started, Williams Nwaneri, the defensive lineman that Georgia had pursued, had gone to Missouri. Now he's in the portal. This is after Missouri seemingly had to spend pretty big to bring him in. So there's going to be a lot of this. We can't give you every name that goes in because it'd be like school closures, which is a long scroll rolling at the bottom the entire time when it snows. But we'll try to kind of highlight what kind of comes out. And so there's a lot of that playing out right now. So why don't we bring the music down? We'll call that Cruising Around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, because I do not want to keep our next guest waiting. A very important name to have on a day like this. It's the former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm. And obviously, Jake, let me begin with this. You know what it's like to win an SEC championship, and you know what it's like to get dramatic wins at Georgia. Have you ever seen anything, though, more dramatic than the way that win played out for the Dogs against Texas on Saturday with Gunner stepping in and playing well and helping Georgia get to that victory, Carson coming back in, and I think you probably as a quarterback kind of understand what it must be like trying to hand the ball off if your arm's not working. That's just such an awe-inspiring effort from Beck in that situation. What did you make of the way in which Georgia got that SEC championship win on Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a team that keeps fighting, doesn't give up, and just finds a way to win when they need it most. I mean, this was just an incredible victory all around. I think this defensive front showed just unbelievable resiliency. Last week when they played Georgia Tech and getting run on for 200-plus yards and then holding Texas, I think, 30-something rush yards the entire football game. That's incredible. Man, I really absolutely hate it for Carson Beck to go down the way he did on a kind of end-to-half Hail Mary that really didn't have too much effect on the game with low probability, and to get hurt in that fashion, man, it's just absolutely terrible. And then in comes Gunner Stockton, who comes in down in that football game and comes back to win that football game. Absolutely incredible. And then Carson comes back, like you said, to hand the ball off for the game-winning touchdown. I've never seen anything like it. You cannot take SEC championships for granted. Man, this is such a huge accomplishment, a big feat, and it means a ton to everybody in that program.
So let me start with this. Beyond that, obviously, we just had a guest on a moment ago, Connor Riley, who was striking a little bit more of a hopeful tone about the Beck injury than I sort of assumed that might be said here. I don't know that if you've ever had the kind of elbow injury that Beck is dealing with, or any kind of relation to that whatsoever. I guess, do you have any insight into what Beck might be dealing with and the various options that could be out there on the basis of whatever this actually is?
Yeah, I mean, it could be torn, it could be strained, kind of talking about this kind of Tommy John UCL muscle that kind of runs down from our elbow to our hand, kind of in that forearm area. I have no idea the extent of it, man. I just know when you kind of get as a quarterback and as a thrower in that compromised position of, hey, he wasn't like just throwing a check down at 5 to 10 yards. No, I mean, he was launching a football 50, 60 yards down the field, giving it everything he has. I mean, that's a pretty compromising position. And I have no idea. I hadn't really kind of talked to anybody there around the program about, the optimism there. And I hope he hasn't played his last down as a Georgia Bulldog. But if he has, man, he was a good one and won a lot of football games.
Did you ever deal with any kind of elbow injury or anything like that? I don't guess at your time at Georgia, but even prior to that, any kind of issues or something like that?
I mean, I've had some tightness here and there kind of growing up, especially back in my younger days, pitching as a kid and travel ball baseball, overthrowing, but nothing to an extent of a strain, and especially anything like this.
So a travel baseball pitcher overusing his arm and overthrowing. I don't think I've ever heard that story before.
You've never heard that, right? Never heard that. So I hope they get that fixed, pitch limit, inning limit, whatever that is, because man, I think it's detrimental to development as a young man and a young thrower.
We've talked before about Gunner Stockton. I know how much respect you have for his game. What did you think of Gunner when he came in on Saturday? And obviously not perfect. I know he'd love to have that interception back, but also an unbelievable scoring drive to begin the third quarter. And honestly, holding on to the football on that hit he took, I don't know that I've ever seen a harder hit in a game. It was really horrifying. And he just got right back up, had the football right there in his hand. That is a tough tough guy, for sure. What did you make of Gunner's overall performance?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, kind of what do you expect a backup coming in on this kind of stage, an SEC championship down in this football game, against supposedly, one of, if not the best team in the country, the Texas Longhorns. Man, it just shows the competitive fire and the toughness out of Gunner throughout this whole game, and especially, in that overtime drive of holding on to that football. I can't sit here and honestly say that my body would have held on to that football, man. It kind of shows just how tough he is, how strong he is. And he went in there and he played his game. His game is going to look different than Carson Beck's game is. The offense is going to look a little bit different. It's going to look slightly more catered to him. And I can't wait to see what Bobo and the offense cooks up here to play whoever this winner is going to be. But man, it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting, and this is going to be a great debut for Gunner Stockton.
I want to ask you more about that here coming up. It's our Kroger Fresh Take with Jake Fromm here today on DawgNation Daily, and of course, you're getting ready for a great Christmas season. By the way, how great does our newly decorated Christmas tree look here? You can still see the Kroger logo, so we got all that figured out here. But a great way to sort of celebrate the Christmas season. And speaking of your own way to celebrate that, Kroger's got all the food you need. You want the greeting cards. You want all the great experience, the decor, everything else. Make this a wonderful holiday season for you and your family. Shop in-store at your local Kroger, online at Kroger.com. And remember, they got great options to take advantage of free pickup, free grocery delivery, the Kroger Boost membership, a great way to do all of that. So make your Christmas and holiday season as convenient as you can make it with our friends from Kroger, online at Kroger.com or in-store today. So going back to your career for a moment, Jake, we all remember season opener against Appalachian State. Obviously, you generate a lot of buzz during the offseason, but Jacob Eason was the starter. He gets hurt like right away, and you're inserted right into the game. How well did you – how comfortable were you with the offensive game plan when you had to be kind of just called into duty, obviously not knowing that was what you're going to be doing that day? Did you know – Did you know it? How comfortable were you with what you're going to be calling, what you're going to be asked to run? How comfortable were you on that? And then a week later, once you knew you were starting and kind of getting prepared against Notre Dame, which was your second game, how much different was that then for you?
Yeah, I want to start by saying that for me, graduating early in high school and coming in during that spring ball period was super beneficial for my development and being able and being ready to play when called upon later that fall. And then I also want to say that, I mean, that was completely new territory for me. I had been pretty much a starter my entire life growing up until that point. I had no idea what, a backup really did or does. That was I expected to play in that game versus I had no idea. My expectations were none. I had none. I just knew to be ready, know what the plan was, and be called upon and ready to play when it was my time. So kind of go in, you play, everything happened fast, and then for that Notre Dame game, and the overwhelming support that I got from my teammates really just helped me throughout that entire week. Got to know the plan, got to take reps, and went in with all the confidence in the world. So, man, I expect that Gunner's probably a lot in that situation. Is getting a lot of support from his teammates because they know who he is, know the kind of guy he is, and know the competitor and the worker he is. So I expect the guys to rally around him and for him to feel all the confidence in the world going in to play this game for the winner of Notre Dame or Indiana.
So a couple of things on this, if you don't mind, because most of us just have no experience with this whatsoever. So Notre Dame game, that's your second game, that's your first official start. You kind of know it's going to be the start. They know you. Is this a situation where they just sort of hand you Jim Chaney's playbook that was your offensive coordinator at the time and say, hey, here's our offense, get ready to run it? Or is that a situation where they say, okay, well, here's what you like to do, here's what you're comfortable doing, and so therefore we're going to kind of build a game plan around sort of what you want to do? In other words, were you just sort of asked to run the offense, or did they create an offense for you that day?
Yeah, I would say at that time, basically that was kind of the offense, and we're running the offense. It was still relatively new in the system, and mine and Jacob's skill set were similar enough, for me to go in and operate. There wasn't like two different body types, where Gunner has this skill set of being a very seasoned runner in high school and shows a lot of those tools, out on paper and on Saturday as well. So they'll do a lot of that to kind of help him ease into this football game, get him some completions early. But for me, it was, hey, let's here it is. You've learned it up until this point, man. We're going to keep doing what we're going to do, and you're going to go help us win this football game. So
last thing for you kind of touched on this a little bit, but because they do have time, they have weeks before their game, that if they wanted to do something unique with Gunner, because Gunner, as you point out, Gunner and Carson are pretty different. If they want to do something unique with him, they do have time to do that. How much of that do you expect that Georgia will say, hey, here's a chance to catch our opponent, not really knowing what we're going to do, and so therefore, Mike Bobo's a creative guy. He's called, different kinds of offenses based on different personnel before. All of a sudden now you sort of build something a little bit different with Gunner now. How much of that do you expect Georgia will do?
Yeah, I'd say probably a 70-30 mix of 70% being, hey, this is our offense, man, this is what we do, and 30% being a couple packages and a couple different wrinkles for Gunner. I think this game's going to be, doesn't matter who you're playing, for Gunner, it's going to be about winning on first and second down so we get into a manageable third down situation. So what's the best way for us to win those games? Is it kind of run pass options and a lot of RPOs? Is it a lot of zone reads? Is it screen passes? Is it kind of advantage perimeter throws? Let's win on early downs. Let's get his confidence up and moving so we get into manageable third downs and get him where it's just not a drop back passing situation where we're down in this game and we have to throw the ball 40 times to win. I don't think the recipe for success for Gunners like that, and for Georgia football, period. Like we did last week with Trevor Etienne, man, let's run the football. Let's dominate the line of scrimmage. And it really doesn't matter what they're going to do because they can't stop us.
Jake, I really appreciate your thoughts on all this because obviously the players involved better and the situation better because of what you do as a quarterback. So thanks for sharing that insight for us today as part of a Kroger Fresh Take. We appreciate your time. We'll look for the chance to speak to you soon.
Brandon, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Very good stuff there. The former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm as a part of a Kroger Fresh Take. An interesting insight. And a lot of us remember, Jake had been kind of a much talked about player prior to the start of his first season, but he does get inserted, boom, right away against Appalachian State, and then obviously was the starter for the remainder of the season. The rest is history. You lead Georgia to an SEC championship and a college football playoff berth. It's one of the reasons why among other stories like that people do have some belief that Gunner Stockton could also be effective for UGA. But as we said before, if it is the Gunner show here in the playoffs, it's not necessarily going to be easy because Georgia's, even if we like the draw for Georgia, it's still a challenge to do this with a backup quarterback. And as Connor Riley cautions us, hey, maybe also leave some space for the fact that perhaps there is I don't even you can call it miraculous, but a positive update on Carson Beck at some point in time, and maybe Beck is also able to get back out there. So we will see. So many variables related to all of this. We'll try to do our best to cover it all. Let me also give a couple of other shouts out before we leave here right now. First of all, our friends at Daytona Beach, 23 miles of shoreline right there on the Atlantic coast of Florida. It's a great place to be. It's super convenient to get to, too. If you want to fly there, they actually have an international airport. So you can fly to Daytona. That means you're not spending a bunch of time. I like to drive, but if you don't want to drive, if you want to fly there, you have the chance to do that. You got great restaurants, awesome outdoor activities, fishing and surfing, and obviously golf and stuff like that. Some of the best restaurants you're ever going to eat at, too. We love Daytona Beach. I grew up going there, and I'm really proud to be inviting people to kind of go visit there. As you think about late fall, early 2025, there's always some really fun stuff going on at Daytona Beach. So check out DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals for more on that. And, of course, you're staying at one of those great resorts. You're enjoying the pool. And speaking of resort-style pools, how'd you like to have one of those at your own home? That's what White's Pools gives you a chance to do right now. They've done that for Coach Mark Richt, the great former Dog, and they can do that for you, too. Beautiful outdoor hardscapes and the great pool stuff. You're going to love all of this. It's a family-owned business, fourth generation, providing great service for folks who want a swimming pool. They've been internationally recognized for their custom design work. Got locations in both Watkinsville and Loganville. And you're going to get that free AquaRite salt system on any of their new construction products. So you can go online. You can book your custom pool design today at whitespools.com. That's WHITES, just like the color, whitespools.com. For more on that today. Obviously, we'll give out a golden shoe here today. It is a good one. Our buddy Mad Dog showing the picture of the Georgia fan chowing down here. It says, Georgia fans waking up after the SEC championship, having a Longhorn T-bone steak, side of Texas toast. It's the breakfast of champions. Hashtag Go Dogs. And great to see that Georgia G, Power G, on the hashtag again. You love that as Georgia earns its way into the college football playoff. And a little bit of a makeshift version of the Lone Star flag back there with the Georgia Power G. So well done by Mad Dog. A golden shoe coming his way. Probably still, even to this day, our most prolific golden shoe winner is our buddy Mad Dog. Really good stuff from him on that. And by the way, as we get closer to lunch, that steak and Texas toast looks pretty good there, too. Lousy, stinking Gators, they got nothing good going on right now, at least as far as we're concerned. 1,494 days, that's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. It's our Gator Hater Updater. Don't forget, Eddie returns January 24th. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that today. So let me go to Facebook because I wasn't on Facebook a little earlier. I'm going to see if I can get this loaded up. We'll take some Facebook comments. We'll take some YouTube comments, some DawgNation.com comments. Yesterday the show was like 17 hours long. I can't do that today. I've got a couple of things I've got to do. But we do want to try to make some space for people to talk about whatever they got going on. So let's get ready to do that. Let's see what else. Philip Jordan Willis says he's a Bevo. Is it Bevo? Is that how you'd say it? Like make some fajitas out of Bevo. Not too bad. Isha Murphy, by the way, we're talking about Carson Beck's elbow. Isha says he just got out of physical therapy for his shoulder. So, Isha, hope that's going well for you and you're on your way to a speedy recovery for sure. Hope that's the case. Let's see what else. Mike Mazzell says Kirby let Beck come in for that last play, knowing we were going to win, so we could finish what he started. There's also some good chatter about, kind of how fired up they got in the huddle when Beck kind of came in. I think it was Tate Ratledge who said, and to me, one of the most fascinating things about football is how chaotic a sideline is that there's a lot of players, there's a lot going on, and they're usually it's almost like a three-ring circus where several things are always happening at once. And so, it's like you're in the huddle getting ready to run the play. There's always the play clock. You got to kind of keep it moving. And like Ratledge says, he just looks in the huddle and boom, there's Carson just sort of standing there, which is, I don't know, it's just kind of cool. It's sort of a cool idea to like, you know, I don't know. It's just, I think the way that Ratledge told that story, I thought was really interesting. But yeah, so I mean, obviously they were clearly fired up about Beck's sort of reassertion into that game. Don Wynn says we need to get back to our game, play great defense, and run the RPO. Yeah, I mean, no matter what, if Georgia's going to really make a run and have a shot to win this national championship, if they're going to really do that, then somehow, some way, being the kind of defensive team they were against Texas, or at least something close to that, you got to find some way to do that. You really do. I just think I think that has to be a huge part of that. I think that has to be a huge part of that. Ben Mathis says move the pocket, get him on the edge where he can run or pass. Yeah, I mean, you'd like to see that. I mean, obviously you want to take advantage of that quarterback run. You know, I also remember going back to when Gunner was in high school that, you know, I always sort of felt like for as good an athlete as he was and as tough as he was to kind of be willing to kind of absorb contact, I always sort of felt like, you know, at the college level, he was going to have to be careful about taking that many hits. And obviously he took it looked like he was dropped from the ceiling on Saturday. The aftermath of that hit he took against Texas. I just don't know that I've seen a more violent collision in a football field before. So you want Beck to run, and you're glad that he got that first down there, but you do also have – you want Stockton to run, and you're glad that he got that first down on Saturday, but you also kind of want to find a way to avoid some of that contact. Craig Hill mentioned the tight ends. To me, that's been one of the coolest things about Georgia, like the last few weeks, sort of Tennessee game forward, is how much better the Georgia tight end plays. I shouldn't even say better because that's an evaluation I don't know that I'm capable of making, but certainly more productive. The tight end play for Georgia has been much more productive, so that's been great. Wendell Brewer says that the same game plan as Bennett, insert and push play. I don't 100% think that. And some of y'all know more than me, so I don't really think of Stockton and Bennett as the same kind of runners. I don't. I think of them as a little bit different. And I also remind you that Stetson Bennett was a Heisman finalist. So while I have a lot of like confidence in Gunner Stockton, I've been saying for a while that I thought that Georgia could be well set up at the quarterback position with Stockton next year. I do believe in Gunner. I just think it's important to note that the guy that he's replacing is going to probably be a pretty high NFL draft pick, and the guy that he's being compared to was a Heisman finalist. That's a lot for Gunner to live up to right now. So I do think that I think that one of the things that Bennett's running style was good for was he had a lot of very good lateral quickness. I just think that Stockton's got his own strengths in the running game, but I do believe, to my eyes, he's a little bit of a different runner than Bennett was. Let's see what else. Let me go to YouTube here for a moment. MG says that Rabun County stepped up big while Gunner was there. He said it was like he brought more confidence to the team. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that's the case. That became a very effective team. Obviously, Jabo Shaw was the coach at the time. He's in South Carolina now, I think. But a really good team, and Stockton had one of the great careers anybody's ever had. Beer Cans and Batty says that Gunner's a little bit more of a downhill Tebow-style runner. That's the way that I think, too. I do. I think of Bennett having a little bit more in the way of lateral quickness. I do. Let's see what else. Michael Castleberry asking about the deal between Smart and Sankey. There's a lot of people talking about that. The look on the look on Sankey's face certainly did not seem to be happy on Saturday. And a lot of folks kind of making a point to say that Sankey didn't congratulate Georgia for winning the SEC. I think here's what I think. I think all of this would serve as a reminder to Greg Sankey that he needs right now a little bit of a PR reboot. That Sankey has made a lot of pursuit of sort of some big, ambitious financial goals for his league and for kind of college sports altogether. But I think that Sankey has sort of perhaps kind of forgotten about his key constituency along the way, which is sort of the random, sort of rank and file fandom of the SEC. I think up until a couple of years ago, I would say that Greg Sankey was probably pretty popular. And I don't believe he's popular now. In fact, here's how I know this is the case. I've been criticizing Sankey now for about a year, probably. And when I first started criticizing him, I got criticism, But over the course of that time of me criticizing Sankey, what I've noticed is the criticism I got for criticizing Sankey, suddenly that started to stop, and people weren't really saying that anymore. Sankey's done a few things that have been unpopular. The Texas schedule, whether that was his doing or not, is the kind of thing he probably needs to answer for. His thought of completely sort of reimagining the NCAA basketball tournament. A lot of y'all don't care about that because you're not necessarily hardcore basketball fans, but a lot of basketball fans were beside themselves about that. It's sort of the example of, boy, Sankey's best attribute used to be that he sort of understood what fans wanted, and in a situation like that, you sort of get the impression that he doesn't. Like, I do believe he has made a calculated error in terms of the compromises he made to his league to sort of make this 12-team playoff work. And for the most part, this hasn't really worked out very well for his league. Only 3 teams in. One of those teams has to go on the road. The team that sort of got the most favorable treatment, Texas, also happened to play the easiest schedule. I mean, I think all of that is right now the kind of thing that you at least have to consider. Now, if he were sitting here right now, he would probably say, well, here's what you're being unfair about, here's what you're not considering. And there's a very good chance that he's right, that perhaps there is a different angle on him that I'm not giving proper credence to. That's why he needs to do a better job of telling his own story, because his people need to understand that he used to be popular and now he's not. And the fact that so many people were happy that Kirby called him out on Saturday, Georgia's a pretty big fan base within this league. And if that many Georgia fans were happy that Kirby called out Sankey, that is a very, very big perception shift from where it was. Sankey led the way towards college football taking place in 2020. If the rest of these people around the sport had had their way, the sport would have been canceled. And if college football did not play in the fall of 2020, everything would have changed forever. And Sankey found a way to do that. At that moment, he was as popular as you ever could be. I think that college football fans really, especially down here in our part of the world, really sort of felt like, man, Sankey's got our back. But a lot has changed since then. It certainly seems like in pursuit of money, he's made the SEC worse. It's bigger, it's more lucrative, but is it actually better? I think the jury is out on that. So we'll see. Paul Moon says that Kirby knows he can say whatever he wants to whomever he wants in the SEC. He's the face of the conference, and Sankey can't say anything about it. I'd say for the most part that's true, but Paul, I would also say we now live in a day and age in which everybody's more outspoken than they used to be. And I think it's probably appropriate. So Kirby's going to complain about his schedule. Lane Kiffin, Shane Beamer, guys like that are going to be very forceful arguing for why they should be in the playoff. Greg Byrne, the Alabama athletic director, going to be very forceful for that too. And obviously when those guys speak up, they get some criticism for it. People say they're whining or whatever else. But the point is they don't care. They're not trying to make you happy. They're trying to support their institution, which even if we don't like some of these institutions because they're our rivals as Georgia fans, I would still say they're doing what they should be doing. So I would say that the SEC that exists now is very different than the one that Mike Slive led and very different than the one that Roy Kramer led. Actually, a little bit more like the one that Roy Kramer led. It's a little bit different than the one that Mike Slive led. Mike Slive was very good at getting everybody to agree that they sort of stopped dropping dimes on each other in terms of like NCAA snitching and stuff like that. Slive led a very harmonious SEC. The SEC that Greg Sankey is in charge of now is nowhere near as harmonious. This is not the Mike Slive era anymore. People are upset and they're fighting, and they are not always taking the high road, if you will, in terms of how they choose to speak about some of this kind of stuff. That's a leadership challenge for Greg Sankey. Let's see what else. Dro Swervo Chavez says that Feinbaum was crying about Kirby calling out Sankey. Is that true? Swervo, I missed that. Frank Patterson wondering about Branson Chubb getting a red shirt. Yeah, I don't know about that. How many? Is he not playing 4 games? I'm not quite so sure. Obviously, I have very big belief, as frankly as I know you do, in a very bright future for Branson Robinson. Hope we see that soon. Andrew Hughes says it's really cool to see you calling the game on Friday. They streamed it from my local news station. I appreciate that, Andrew. Yeah, that was awesome. I know we were on down there in Albany on the CBS affiliate down there, so that was really cool. I love calling games. I really do. It's our last game on Friday. I'm sad when it's over with. I just enjoy it. There is something about the live event that's just really addictive. And I get some of that. Not to say I don't love doing DawgNation Daily. That's not what I'm saying. But there's just a different juice to like the live sporting event because you don't know what's going to happen. When I come do a show on DawgNation Daily, especially for me, I'm going on now like 10 years of doing this. I know how every show is going to go. And it's just one of those things where I just sort of sit down and I do the show as I have it planned in my head. And it just sort of comes out that way. But with a football game, you don't know what's going to happen. The Justice Terry, the commitment decisions are a little bit like this too, where it's like, okay, you're going to call it as it happens. And who knows? This is live. We're going to see something happen here one way or another. There's a little bit of juice related to something like that, but calling the game where you really just don't know what you're about to see, I find that to be really addictive. I do. But thank you for saying that. That's really nice of you. Let's see what else. Brodo Baggins says Diego Pavia just scored on Bama again, which is very funny. Taylor Russell says do the show past noon. One of these days we may do that, but that day can't be today. I got some family stuff I got to take care of. Garrison Tucker says, how did this season go by so fast? I thought we just beat Clemson. Garrison, I'm telling you right now, I had like a really serious conversation with some people about this other day. Like I'm very aware of like cliches and like, it's like everybody says, boy, time, where'd the time go? But I've had to I think it was my wife and me talking this the other day, or somebody, I think it was her, where I was like, I seriously don't know where the time went. Like life cannot go by this fast. This is alarming. And I'll be just totally honest with you. There are a couple of Georgia games this year that, to give you an idea of how fast it seems like this season has gone by. For the first time in my life, there are like a couple of Georgia games that I barely remember. Like, I don't really remember the Auburn game at all. I know it happened. Georgia won. I remember last year's Auburn game. I don't really remember this year's Auburn game. It's just sort of a for instance of just crazy, because I think the also thing, too, is my kids are getting a little bit older. And so as you get a little older, they have more going on. My daughter's doing a couple different sports. My son plays baseball literally every single day. And that's just what they love, and I love that for them. My wife is, kind of working again, something she hadn't been doing. So our family is busier than it was. And so you pair that with just the regular pace of a season. It really concerns me how fast all this goes, and the fact that somehow it's just sort of a blur that I don't even really remember things that happened like a few weeks ago. Like, that can't be healthy. That can't be healthy. But it is true. Let us see what else. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. Frank on this is at DawgNation.com. Yeah, so the 2025 schedule, is that tonight or tomorrow? That's tomorrow, right? So we already know the opponents. They're just going to give us the dates. And for Georgia, it is just the flip-flop of this year's schedule. That's not what they originally intended. So this is another thing, like I was saying before, which is like when Mike Sly was the SEC commissioner, it's a very harmonious league. Everybody's in agreement on everything, and everything just sort of runs smoothly. And every year the league makes more money than it did the year before. And it's just all like these were peace times. An example of the sort of leadership challenge that Greg Sankey's currently facing is they cannot agree on a scheduling model. That the schedule they announced for 2024 was like a one-off year because they couldn't agree on a permanent model. And they were supposed to have something new in place for 2025, but they couldn't agree on that either. So, therefore, they're kind of running it back for that. My assumption is they will then flip-flop the league teams unless they come up with something different before that for 2026, 2027. There had been some kind of off-the-record chatter that maybe they were getting closer to going to a 9-game conference schedule, that they might actually have enough agreement to do that. But now, given the way the committee's behaved, you sort of wonder if that's the case. By the way, I believe we're also going to have if I had to assume, a massive change, the college football playoff coming in 2026. So the scheduling mess in the SEC has been a total debacle. And I do think the fact that they did not have a plan in place to get more money than other than just sort of the prorated money. In other words, when you go from a 14-team to a 16-team league, the prorated money by adding 2 additional teams, I do believe that was an error. They should have negotiated that beforehand, and they didn't. Oh, Scott Harris says he thinks that the hit from Bullard on Harrison in the Peach Bowl was more violent than the one that Gunner took. Perhaps that's the case. Perhaps that's the case. I mean, certainly in a big moment, it's as good a hit as you can ever have. You may be right about that. You may be right about that. Johnny Prescott asked about Jaden Rashada. Eventually, we're going to talk about the 2025 quarterback situation. But it was, I think it should have been telling to all of us that when Kirby mentioned whatever about who would come in place of Gunner Stockton, the next name that he mentioned was Ryan Puglisi. I do think you should take something from that, and that does line up with what I've been kind of hearing for most of the year. I do not believe, in other words, that Jaden Rashada is the number 3 quarterback at Georgia right now. UJ Marine and Trippy Charlie talking about the agreement that gets Texas and Oklahoma into the league. All I can say about this is I would certainly hope that the appearance of a preferential schedule for Texas is coincidental. I would certainly hope that's true. I can't stand the thought that the SEC acquiesced to, well, if we're coming to the SEC, y'all better take it easy on us that first year. I can't stand the thought that the SEC might have done that. I can't stand the thought that the SEC might have done that. I would hope this league is better than that. Savannah Bryan says, I don't like Sankey, but I am glad they waited on a new schedule model to see how the College Bowl Committee values strength of schedule. Well, I don't believe that's the reason why they waited, but perhaps it ends up working out to the SEC's benefit that they did wait. You may be right about that. Brandon Griffin says the narrative is becoming you can go elsewhere for more money or come to the G to play for championships and league coaching and development. To a certain extent, that is true, but let's also keep it real here, that Georgia wouldn't even be a hat on the table for players if it wasn't also trying to play the NIL game aggressively too. In other words, it is not as simple as saying, well, they're offering you money, but we're offering you a chance to be great. You also have to offer money too. Now, if your money's right and if your development opportunity is better, well, that's how you really win with recruits. But, Georgia may not have the most NIL dollars available. We're assuming they probably don't. But I would say they're pretty close, and I would say that Georgia, for the most part, is pretty aggressive in using it. I think in the case of Justice Terry, you talk to people who know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, they just got outbid. And sometimes that happens. I mean, those of us who are baseball fans, we see this kind of thing happen. I mean, sometimes the Mets swoop in and give Juan Soto $50 million a year or whatever. Sometimes you do just get outbid. Now, what do you do to get outbid less? You probably have to sort of ask that question. But don't, I would say, assume that Georgia getting outbid means that Georgia didn't have a very substantial offer of its own on the table. It just wasn't the highest offer. And also, Sky Harris says it's get paid a little bit more now or get paid more later. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Like, obviously, I have always believed, like the old adage, and Georgia was sort of selling this to begin with. Hey, NFL is worth more than NIL. NFL worth more than NIL. That's kind of like the rallying cry. But the truth is, given sort of the time value of money, to turn this into an economics class, some of the figures being thrown around right now, to have that money now, I mean, the old adage that the NFL is definitely worth more than NIL, given, and I've always been the first one to tell you that a lot of this stuff is exaggerated. And I think that some of it still really is. I really do. I think there's still a lot of exaggeration that goes on. But I have also heard some stuff that's just crazy. And if it is true, and the people that were telling me had no reason to lie, then all of a sudden now it's not necessarily just conventional wisdom that the NFL is worth more than NIL. Not in some of these situations. Some of these situations, when you think about the actual value of having that money in your possession right now, some of this stuff is almost high enough because, just to give you an idea of how like my brain works from a financial sense, if you give me $2 million right now, I almost don't care if I play in the NFL or not. Even though the NFL could be multiples of that, $2 million invested correctly is enough to last you for the rest of your life. Whereas if it's $1 million or less, one way or another, you're going to run out of that money. Or you're going to have to, it's good to have $1 million, but you still got to work. You have to do something for a living. $2 million can be enough invested correctly to really make a difference in your income for the rest of your life in a way that I would say that $1 million in a lump sum is not necessarily the same type of deal. So, I mean, we're just sort of hearing these sort of like 7-figure things thrown around a lot more, frequently now, to the point where, gosh, I mean, if somebody's really offering that, then what are you supposed to do? DT on the subject of the SEC sometimes kind of giving Georgia the short end of the stick. There's certainly been a couple of examples of that we would all cite here. And we do think that now Georgia is in a little bit of a position where it's not going to be taking stuff like that quite so kindly anymore. And I think that's good. I think that's good for Georgia. UJ Marine asking about Underwood getting like the $10 million at Michigan. I mean, whether it was actually $10 million or not, it was a very, very high figure. And, like whatever Terry actually got, it was a very, very high figure. A very, very high figure. It was almost certainly a 2 comma figure. Almost certainly. And beyond that, the actual specifics of it is for somebody else to figure out. But almost certainly, the Terry thing had to be 2 commas. It just had to be. So do with that what you will. Let's see what else. Savannah Bryant says the Kirby Sankey thing was overblown. Yeah, a lot of times, like, the video of, like, the stone-faced guy. I mean, y'all see my listening face all the time. It's not exactly the prettiest thing. So some of that's probably true. So Andrew asking about Colbie Young. So the arraignment is this afternoon. And I believe it's likely those charges will be dropped. But obviously, in a court of law, you can never know for sure exactly how that's going to play out. And, that kind of makes people mad because, obviously, Young's attorney is doing right by Colbie by arguing on his behalf, and the accuser has kind of recanted her original claim. The only thing I'll say about this is that criminal cases like this get a lot of scrutiny. And, while you don't want to be, bringing charges against somebody who doesn't deserve them, people are also, especially given the, climate, around the world, you also want to be careful about when you drop charges. I mean, like, there's just a lot of scrutiny in a situation like this, and everybody around it's going to be moving carefully. And I'm not going to say much more about it than that. But, there is more than just the, Athens police versus Georgia football part of all of this in play in a situation like that. But I am not going to get any deeper into it than that. Your Saul says that Georgia didn't come anywhere close to Texas on the offer for Terry. So just like I obviously don't know the contracts and don't know the specifics. I don't even pretend to. I never try to pretend to know more than I do in front of all y'all. I got too much respect for you than that. I do have reason to believe, though, that Georgia was really aggressive. Now, if you didn't win, I guess it doesn't really matter. But, this idea that Georgia's just out there like, brother, can I spare a dime? Pauper, in a situation like this. Georgia's got dollars, and Georgia's willing to use those dollars, and Georgia's willing to be very aggressive. In this case, somebody else just, came over the top. But I do think it's important to understand that Georgia is certainly playing an aggressive hand out there in the NIL space, I'm led to believe. And by the way, coming up in the new year, I think we're going to have a lot more to say about NIL at some point around here, but it is not time to do that yet. We got to get ready to go. James Richards says the NIL can ruin a team culture. That's why Kirby's not overpaying any kid with no experience. Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously been the conventional wisdom too. But I'm just telling you now. Y'all just got to try to keep it real. This idea that sort of NIL culture is beneath Georgia. There are certain kinds of recruits, good defensive linemen, good receivers, good whatevers, that you're not getting them without spending big dollars. You're just not. You are not going to get them to come to your program simply out of the goodness of their heart and the authenticity of your intentions. So, this idea that, NIL buying players is beneath us because we got a culture to protect. You can have a team culture but no first-round picks in the defensive line, and that is not going to go to the college football playoff. So I just think it's really, really important to have a very open and honest conversation about some of this kind of stuff, which is that some of what was sort of being said at the beginning of the pay-for-play era and what the actual thing is sort of looking like now is probably just a little bit different, that there is no one trying to compete at the highest level that isn't also committed to playing the dollar game at the highest level too. And, doesn't mean that they don't still try to have a good team culture and stuff like that. But getting used to different guys getting paid different amounts of money and making peace with that in your own way, the same way they obviously do in the NFL, that's just what college football is now. And Georgia's no different than anybody else on that, if we're being honest. Because remember, I believe I'm right about this. After this year, for 2025 going forward, I believe everybody on the Georgia roster will have come in within the NIL era, I believe. So Garrison Tucker says, do we see NIL get throttled back in the next few years? So here's what I believe, and we'll get ready to wrap up after this. I do not believe anyone is coming to save us from like a congressional standpoint or anything like that. I just don't believe it's popular enough. And I don't want to get much deeper into it than that, but in terms of the kind of like obvious consensus that gets elected officials looking to act, I don't believe it's popular enough. I think there are a lot of people that look. There are a lot of people who want college football to be destroyed. Okay, so I mean, some of this chaos is not by accident. A purpose of a system is what it does. And so if the system is making college football more and more chaotic every single year, then you should assume the system is functioning as intended because that is what systems do. So there is a certain aspect of this sort of chaos in college football. When people see it happen, they're like, good. They don't like college football. College football sort of always sort of dealt with that type of thing. There are a lot of people who've always wanted to see college football kind of diminished within the American sports landscape. And one of these days they may get their wish. And beyond that, there's also people that just don't care. Like think about how big Washington is. There's a huge pocket of people that just don't really care. So this idea that someone's going to step in and offer some legislation that sort of brings all this into some sort of sense of normalcy, I don't really get the sense that's likely to happen. Maybe the wind's blowing in a different direction, but for now, I don't really think that's the case. Let me tell you what I do think could happen, though. I've heard a couple of stories related to some of this kind of stuff, and it's not my news to break, and who knows what's true. So I try to be careful about what rumors I say, but away from Georgia, other programs. I've heard certain stories about you had to pay this. I wouldn't get like some of the stuff is just so crazy about how many different payments you had to make just to get one player that you're almost led to believe, well, there's no way that's sustainable. Like eventually the people paying that money are just going to get tired of it. And let's say you're Ole Miss, for instance, you put a huge roster together and they did a really good job constructing that roster, but all it really got them was like fifth best in the SEC. Like, are they going to be as motivated to spend that money again? I would say that Texas A&M, whatever was true about the whole sliced bread and whatever that A&M spent on their 22 recruiting class, it seems like the next year they were not quite as excited about spending that same amount of money. That bubbles burst and markets correct. And as crazy as the market is right now, there is probably a market correction coming for if you spend say let's just use the number that's been thrown around. If you spend $10 million on Bryce Underwood, if you're Larry Ellison's wife or whatever that is, El Presidente, if you spend $10 million on the quarterback, well, what if he doesn't win a national championship? Because it is entirely possible that he won't, because that's how it goes. Are you less enthusiastic about just sort of doing that again for the next guy? Tennessee may deal with that when it comes to Nico. Nico, I think, played better against Vanderbilt, but I don't know that Nico Iamaleava had a great year this year. And they spent a lot of money on him. So, at least reportedly. So, in other words, people love the idea of spending big to help their team win. But if you spend big and the winning doesn't immediately happen, I can imagine you're not quite as excited about doing that in the future. So we could see a little bit of a market correction just come from sort of a general loss of enthusiasm when some of these financial investments don't pan out. Because I got to tell you, in all sports all the time, who's going to actually really achieve and who's not is always going to be a little bit unpredictable. George Herndon says, look at the Buckeyes. Yeah, we're led to believe $20 million roster. And, they go out and spend big on a running back. And I'm not trying to pick on, Quinshon Judkins or whatever else. But, y'all, who you should be spending money on are the guys, like the positions that get drafted in the NFL draft, first round. It's quarterback, wide receiver, offensive tackle, edge rusher, defensive line, and cornerback. And obviously, the place like Georgia, they've kind of made their hay on all the positions being good, right? Inside linebacker, safety, guard, center. Like, Georgia's really good at just being great at everything. But I think the nature of the sport's somewhat changing a little bit, where it's going to be a little bit more like the NFL, where you got to be really good at the positions that matter most. And so if you're bringing in a big free agent, you just got to make sure it's one of the most impactful positions, I think. All right, let me just do one quick thing, and then we're going to go. Faison Cecil checks in to say, go Dogs. Faison, good to see you. Jeff Ingram says the pendulum will swing back a bit. I mean, pay for play is always going to be here, NIL, revenue sharing, things like that. But some of the craziness of the NIL, at some point in time, that market just may stabilize and become more efficient. And unfortunately, what's going to end up happening is, and I hate this, you're going to see a few players get a lot of money in terms of the extra NIL stuff. A few players are going to get a lot, and most players are going to get almost nothing. Because eventually, if you want to have enough money to pay the going rate for like the Bryce Underwood type guy, the only way to get that is to make sure you take it from the other players. And so when it's all said and done, we're gonna have done all of this, all of the changing to college athletics, to make a small number of players richer sooner than they otherwise would have been. And I just, for the life of me, don't understand, will that have all been worth it? Because a lot of players are going to lose their roster spots. A lot of non-revenue sports are going to probably go away. And all of this will essentially end up enriching a few players a little sooner than they otherwise would have been were they to go on to the NFL. Like, it's just such a weird thing. Such a weird thing that we're doing. Completely reimagining college sports, one of the most popular things in American life, and the only sport that's uniquely American. You understand that? College football is the only sport that's uniquely American. We're just going to just put it all at risk and jeopardy to benefit a very, very small number of players. In other words, if you look at everybody that sort of counts as sort of an NCAA athlete or even like a Division I athlete across all sports, are the majority of them going to be helped by what we're doing right now? I have a hard time believing it's the majority. A few of them are going to get huge financial windfalls. Most of those people, whether it be Bryce Underwood or the Cavender twins, they're going to be rich anyway. That's just how it goes. So I don't know. Now, Lewis says, will a salary cap take over the NIL? So obviously you're going to have revenue sharing coming up, but as it's been explained to me, because one of the things I sort of thought was, as a trade-off for the revenue sharing, I thought the teams might could convince the players to sign over their NIL rights. Now the team will negotiate that for you. But I've been told that's not necessarily going to be the case. These players will get their revenue sharing payments and they'll still have free access to their NIL. Although I did see something the other day that in the latest, there's the House settlement that's sort of like the big thing, that sort of governs all of this and, whatever. But that they are going to put what they call a fair market value cap on some of this kind of stuff. In other words, if I'm going to do let's say that DawgNation is going to host an autograph signing with Cash Jones. So we're going to bring in Cash Jones, and we're going to pay cash for the autograph signing. Okay, well, what is the fair market rate for that? I'd say, a few $1,000s. That's probably pretty appropriate. But if I say, hey, Cash Jones, I want you to come here for 2 hours. I want you to sign autographs. We're going to pay you $500,000 to do that. Well, in the old world, that's actually how some people were kind of getting their NIL dollars. They were getting paid exorbitant fees for very small things. It sounds like, at least based on something I read the other day, they may not be able to do that quite as much anymore. But that's also not even agreed upon yet, so who knows? Let's get one more. Randy Hall wondering if it's a Billy Napier, a UCL injury that's keeping him from being able to open his water bottle, which is very funny. Very funny. All right, anything else before we go? We ended up staying late after I said we weren't going to. Jason King says, we recruited Terry since 8th grade. Texas offers in October, and a day before signing, they tell him whatever Georgia offered will double it. It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, having been in Austin the same weekend that Terry was taking his official visit there was nobody that was really thinking, oh, my gosh, Texas is making a huge impression on Justice Terry. None of that. Like, this was not a traditional old-school recruitment. It just was not. This was not a, man, Texas just gives me, boy, it feels like home. Feels like home. There was not much of that when it comes to this. This was very much a contemporary recruiting story for sure. All right, we're going to go. Good stuff. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price is promised. You can trust them on all that today, including getting your heating system ready to go for a long winter. It's been cold lately. Even colder weather is on the way. You got to imagine our friends at RS Andrews get you ready for that. So find them online. It's rsandrews.com. It'll only cost you $99. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll talk to you then.